And welcome, everybody. Once again, sorry for the delay. My name is Flemming Rose, and on behalf of the AHA Foundation, I want to welcome you to the first in a series of Ayaan Hirsi Ali Dialogues. And today I will be your host, and the topic of our dialogue will be free speech. Let me start by introducing our two speakers. First, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is the founder of the AHA Foundation, a research fellow at the Hoover Foundation, and the author of several books, among them The Challenge of Dawah, Political Islam as Ideology and Movement, and How to Counter It, a book that might be relevant for today's dialogue. And our other panelist is Jacob Mchangama. He is the CEO of the Future of the Free Speech Project, a research professor at Vanderbilt University, and the author of Free Speech, a history from Socrates to social media that has just been published in paperback. And people in the audience are welcome to forward questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll see if there'll be time to answer them toward the end of our conversation. First, I'll kindly ask Ayaan and Jacob to provide their answer to a foundational question when it comes to free speech. Why do we need free speech at all? Why is it important? And what's the value of free speech? Ayaan, will you go first, please? 5-7 minutes.
Flemming, thank you very much for doing this. Jacob, it's wonderful to see you. And to my audience, welcome. It's great to have you. And I think the topic, free speech, amazingly, is a hot topic 20 years on after 9/11/2001. I want to start by identifying the freedom of speech simply as the right to offend. I start with the right to offend because it makes it very distinct from a separate issue, and that is the issue of civility, the issue of good manners, the issue of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate on social occasions, in public, etc. That is not, as far as I'm concerned, what the freedom of speech is about. The freedom of speech concerns the freedom, as we say, the ability to express ideas, to express art, to express every form of, I would say, dialogue, and especially when it's controversial. The freedom and the freedom of speech relates to the government or the state. So those that have power do not have the power to legislate or ban the expression of speech. I think people say that the First Amendment of the United States is the most radical protection of free speech as we know it, even more radical than in European countries. Why is it valuable? To me, it is valuable because all other freedoms in a democratic society are meaningless without the freedom of speech. You cannot have freedom of religion without freedom of speech. You cannot have the freedom to assemble without freedom of speech. You can't have any kind of freedom without the freedom of speech. So that is inherently why it is valuable. It's extremely important as we have the debates today about the protection of minorities. And I think in a robust, well-functioning, well-established, mature democracy, we do protect the rights of minorities. But the rights of minorities are best protected also with a robust protection of the freedom of speech. Flemming, do you think I've made my conception of
absolutely. I just, before I turn it over to Jacob, I just want to ask a follow-up question. to clarify your definitions. How do you make a distinction between, good manners and civility on the one hand, and self-censorship and the need not to offend people deliberately in our interactions?
I think the two are not mutually exclusive, but they're separate discussions. I think civility is something I hope that we all agree with. And civility comes from a place of expressing yourself in a way that is sociable, that is polite. But as we all know, political ideas, religious ideas, artistic ideas can offend people's sensibilities. And so it is entirely possible, I would say, to express an idea as Karl Marx has done, or John Stuart Mill has done, or John Maynard Keynes have done, to express yourself with the utmost civility and yet offend. Ideas also have consequences, and I think people see those consequences through and think, well, if we allow Karl Marx to publish his ideas, what if? And so then it brings us back to, and this is, I think, what makes it distinct from civility, the involvement of government. Mm-hmm. Government does not involve itself in what is polite and what's impolite, generally speaking. But government can control ideas, can seek to control ideas, because those people in government would like, obviously, to amass power and to hold on to power unchecked. The freedom of speech protects the polity, protects society from a government and from concentrated power, and from a government that seeks to have power unchecked. And not just government, but in general, all people who want to have power unchecked.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Ayaan. I'm sure we'll come back to the issue of minorities and free speech. Jacob, then I want to turn it over to you, 5-7 minutes, or if you want to say less, you're welcome, but 5-7 minutes to you.
Yeah, well, it's always difficult to follow Ayaan, of course, and many of the arguments and justifications for free speech made eloquently by Ayaan, I wholeheartedly agree with. Having looked at free speech through the angle of history, I would say that it's the idea of free speech began and was intimately connected with democracy. So the first established democracy that we know of, at least in history, the Athenian democracy, and it was comparatively at the time also a radically egalitarian idea, the idea that every freeborn male citizen in the Athenian democracy had a right to speak and vote in a direct democracy, but also that there was a cultural component to free speech, uninhibited speech called parousia, where the larger culture of free speech was open to having someone like Plato, for instance, set up shop, even though he was very much critical of democracy, did not approve of democracy, and having set the stage for science, art, and so on to flourish. And I think, unfortunately, there's been this tension between an egalitarian conception of free speech with its roots in ancient Athens, and a more elitist conception of free speech with its roots in the Roman Republic, which is more top-down, which says that free speech is important, but it should be administered by the well-educated elite and not the unwashed mob of the commoner. I'm very much a strong proponent of egalitarian free speech, even though I also recognize that when you have egalitarian free speech, it is likely to cause disruptions. It will allow a lot of voices that are unpleasant, and some of them might even have destructive aims. But I think that history tends to suggest that a lot of the people that we saw as being too ignorant or dangerous to have a voice in public affairs, whether it was women, whether it was racial, religious minority, the poor, and the propertyless. We now see them as core constituents of an open liberal democracy. And so this tension between free speech, egalitarian and elitist free speech is very much alive today in our digital age of social media, where there's an increasing tendency, I think, after some years of being very positive about the role of free speech, seeing it as sort of the way to spread democratic liberal values to the rest of the world. People have become much more cynical about it because they realize that it can also channel hatred, disinformation. Authoritarian states can use it, and now there's a big move, I think, towards a more elitist, top-down conception of free speech, which I think ultimately is a cure worse than the disease, and will be abused by the powers of be, by the institutional gatekeepers, to impose new forms of control. And therefore, I think, when we look at the role that increasingly egalitarian free speech has played, when it comes to abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement in the US, when it comes to the rights of women all over the world, when it comes to the rights of the working class to be allowed to have a voice and vote in democracies, when it comes to anti-colonial movements and so on, I think free speech is what an Enlightenment meme called the bulwark of liberty, maybe the most influential Enlightenment meme when it comes to free speech, that went worldwide and became sort of the impetus behind huge advances in free speech in the 18th century. And I still think that the bulwark of liberty is worth fighting for everyone who's concerned about both freedom and equality in the rule of law and democracy.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up question to you too. Could you say a little bit more about why you prefer the egalitarian concept of free speech to the elitist? And I think another way of phrasing this in today's world would be an exclusive concept of free speech versus an inclusive concept of free speech.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you only have to go back. Ayaan mentioned that the First Amendment is the most speech protective provision of any in human history, probably, but that was not always a given. So if you go back to 1919, women's rights advocates were protesting outside the White House, and they were burning in effigy Woodrow Wilson and calling him sort of a traitor, and they were arrested, these women. Now, 100 years later, I was living in New York, and there was a demonstration against President Trump by women in pussy hats, and they were shouting things that were much more critical of the president than the people in Washington in 1919. But the NYPD was there to protect them. In other words, free speech was a guarantor of the rights of women to speak their mind, to ultimately achieve equality and the right to vote. And the same story you could say with the civil rights movement, as I said, was an absolutely crucial played an absolutely crucial part in expanding the First Amendment to its current status. So groups that were previously marginalized benefited from an increasingly egalitarian conception of free speech. But and even though some of the voices today that benefit from social media and sort of relatively unmediated access to the public sphere might be seen as sort of corrosive to democracy and dangerous and so on, I also think that a lot of very interesting voices and perspectives have been added. And I cannot imagine us going back to a time where the public sphere would be dominated by a tiny elite of journalists, editors, public intellectuals, and prominent politicians who could decide on who had a voice in public affairs. That to me would be a huge retrograde step.
Mm-hmm. Before I go on with my questions, I want to give Ayaan a chance to comment or elaborate your reflections on what Jacob just said.
I want to say what Jacob just said is excellent. So it would be more of an elaboration. And I would say, yes, indeed, in terms of elitist versus egalitarian, the elites, whether they are the ones in power or those who have access to them and relations with them, either through money relations or through friendships and family relations, the elites always want to maintain that power. So it is for the rest of society to inquire, to explore, to criticize those relationships and that power, and why there should be a need to share power, etc. So my only elaboration would be we have to be mindful of the elite of the day. It could be that I belong to the elite of the day or you belong to the elite of the day. And I'm in this comfortable position where I don't want to give up power and I don't want to give up a privilege. And so any kind of criticism that comes at the government of the day is seen to be heretical. And I think that freedom of speech is by definition the poor man's or the weapon of the underprivileged or those seeking more privilege to say, we need justice, we need fairness, we need access. I think Jacob beautifully demonstrated the rights of women, an example with the rights of women, but it's the rights of religious minorities, those who are excluded on religious grounds, those who are excluded on racial grounds. And today, again, we see in many places those who are excluded on geographical grounds. If you live in the middle of the country in the United States, you tend to be dismissed as what was the term that Hillary Clinton used? It's escaping me now, but
the deplorables.
The deplorables, yeah. And so it is, as we're currently, undergoing this, everybody is fighting for their rights, but it's also the right of the deplorables to say, stop it right there. We're not deplorables, and we're here to inquire, to criticize, and to share in power. And that's what freedom of speech is all about.
Quite often, proponents of free speech are being perceived as if they are in favor of unrestricted speech under any circumstances. And in fact, I remember a few years ago, I gave a speech in Russia, which I couldn't give today, where there were some libertarian Russians who were very upset that I was in favor for some limitations on free speech. But in this context, Jacob, if you want to go first, I mean, what do you think are legitimate limitations on free speech in a liberal democratic society?
Yeah, so I don't think it's possible to sort of exhaustively delve into all kinds of limits on speech, because there's some that we don't, fraud is impossible without using speech, but no one, very few at least, would say that fraud should be protected speech, for instance. But what I'm specifically concerned about, I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I'm more of a viewpoint absolutist, which means that I don't believe that any specific ideology, idea should be banned or restricted alone. Only when it comes to, so a good example could be, unlike in Germany, I would not be in favor of banning Holocaust denial or even displaying the Nazi symbols. But if you were to,
why not?
Yeah, well, let me just. But if you were to congregate in front of a synagogue with Nazi symbols and say, let's go get the Jews, then that would be sort of incitement to violence. And that's where I would draw the line. And sometimes, where do you draw it exactly? You can have gray zones, but that sort of is saying you can have odious ideas. Those ideas are allowed, but you cannot act on them. And why is because, first of all, if you allow viewpoint discrimination, then almost inevitably the ideas that are banned will be those that run against the prevailing orthodoxy or the powers that be. And you might argue, well, certain countries in Eastern Europe have said, well, our most recent experience with totalitarianism is communism, so why shouldn't we ban communist symbols, as is the case in certain countries? And then the list can quickly become very, very long. And then I don't know, we can get into this later, but I've also looked sort of pretty closely at the history of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, and my conclusion is that there were several restrictions on Nazis and other political movements during the Weimar Republic that did not manage to stop the Nazis, and in certain cases actually actively helped them, and even provided legislation that allowed the Nazis, once they were in power, to limit free speech. That's a big discussion. I'm not saying free speech and censorship is what ultimately led to the rise of Nazism. There were many other important factors, but it just suggests to me that this Weimar fallacy that you shouldn't expect censorship to be able to protect democracy against totalitarian movements.
Mm-hmm. But if you should shortcut your approach to legitimate limitations, would that then be incitement to violence in a broad sense? You also spoke about fraud.
Yeah, well, I think there are others. It could be sort of narrow categories of defamation. New York Times versus Sullivan is a classic case that protects media and others, against successful defamation suits by public officials. It was a bit of a shame that the Fox and Dominion case wasn't decided in court, because it would sort of tell us where the line is drawn in today's age. But on the other hand, once you have very broad defamation laws, they can be abused. Even in democracies, President Macron in France has on several occasions sued people, for instance, for comparing him to Hitler, which I think, that's just something. If you're the most powerful person and the head of state, you have to be able to every day wake up and accept that people compare you to Hitler. That's just par for the course. In Italy, the current right-wing government, 3 ministers have sued a journalist who's critical of the mafia. So I would be in favor of sort of very narrow laws against defamation. Threats is another thing, which I think is something that maybe should be cracked down on more on social media, because that's not an attempt to answer speech with speech. That's an attempt to silence people through making them afraid. So those are just some categories of limitations of free speech that I think are not only justified, but also necessary.
And Ayaan, legitimate restrictions on speech in a liberal democracy?
I am going to say very openly, I am a freedom of speech absolutist, free speech absolutist. And I say that having thought through over many years the trade-off, the cost-benefit analysis of, for every speech that you restrict, try and think about its cost and the benefit that you pay for in society. And I think every time I reach the conclusion, and I think this is an exercise that all of us who are interested in preserving freedom of speech should do this exercise. Every single time, think about an issue and you have to make that cost-benefit analysis. Are we better off censoring that speech or not? Number one. Number two, I want to go back to say really things along the lines of civility. That's a separate issue from freedom of speech. And so is defamation. There is in every civilized society legislation against defamation and libel. These take place in civil court cases, not in penal court cases, and then fraud, same thing. That's also been fully legislated. It is really about upholding the existing laws, not trying to bring in censorship by using defamation and libel and civility as excuses to curb speech. Now, what I thought was very interesting was the reference that Jacob made to the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And if you look back, yes, there were many factors that contributed to the rise of National Socialism. But if you think about the rise of an intolerant ideology and a movement, and you ask yourself, is censorship a good idea or a bad idea? I think every time we reflect back on history, we're going to find that censorship was in fact a bad idea, because had they been seen for what they are, had they not been censored, we would have had, or society would have had, the transparency, and they would have had the opportunity to analyze the ideas. Let me stick now with National Socialism, analyze those ideas and reject them more robustly. Right now in the United States of America, I think we're in the middle of a movement, an intolerant movement, political movement that now carries the symbol Wokism. Wokism is, of course, an amalgam of all sorts of ideas, but at its core, it's a very intolerant political ideology. And I'm the first one to say that let's have full-on freedom of speech, question them, criticize them, inquire, expose them, so that we understand what their objectives are and what their means are. And that, for me, is the most powerful argument of why I am a radical freedom of speech absolutist.
Mm-hmm. Before I ask you about why you perceive Wokism as a free speech, I want to ask Jacob if you want to comment. It seems to me there might be a slight disagreement here, or is it just differences when it comes to the finer details?
I don't know. If absolutist is taken, at its sort of definition, that would also include sort of protecting threats, which I think is antithetical to free speech. You would know that better than anyone, Flemming, or both of you, because you've been living with threats, with real threats from people who would kill you for your ideas. And I think I like what Salman Rushdie said. Like Salman Rushdie, who was once asked, I think it was there were these Islamists demonstrating in London with these placards that said, "Behead those who insult Islam." And he was asked, shouldn't this be banned? And he said, no, because this is not a direct threat. This is not direct incitement to me. And I agree with him. You should be allowed, if you're an Islamist, to write, "Behead those who insult Islam." But if you send a message directly to Salman Rushdie saying, unless you withdraw your book or you come up with an apology, I will kill you and your family, that to me is a direct threat, and that should not be protected. Someone like that should be prosecuted and sent to jail. So that's sort of where I see where you distinguish.
Ayaan?
And I think because, Jacob, because of your last remarks, I don't really think that there is any disagreement between us. And I think it's very interesting usually when you have discussions for there to be some disagreement, because it's entertaining for the audience. But we really do not disagree. And I think threatening people, it's a crime. And it's properly legislated. And, people who threaten me, Flemming, people who threaten you, and God forbid, Jacob, I hope you're not threatened. But threats are already legislated for. You report, the person committing the act is charged, and there's a procedure for prosecution and beyond. But I think that really is distinct from radical ideas. So again, to go back to the Salman Rushdie case, the individuals who are holding the banners, behead those. I've had my name on some of those banners. Behead those who
insult Islam,
insult the prophets, this and that. And they do hold these radical ideas, and they have this worldview, and they have this political philosophy that has its roots in religion that they want to impose on the rest of the world. And I think that society benefits the most if we understand what their ideas are, what their objectives are, and the means by which they want to get to their objectives. If we understand that as a society, because we guarantee them the freedom of speech and we protect their freedom of speech, then we have, as a society, the opportunity to protect ourselves from their designs of absolutist power, first and foremost by fighting for the audiences that they seek to influence, because we also then have access to those audiences, and we can persuade those audiences of better ways of living peacefully together and better, more superior philosophical ideas that are out there. And I think the most important thing that you have to realize about censorship that is cloaked or shrouded in protective language. For instance, you don't want children to hear certain bad words because their brains are not developed enough, and they can act on or say things that they shouldn't be saying. But as grown-ups, as adults, I think we have to make the assumption that every grown-up is endowed with reason, and that every grown-up has the capacity and the agency to distinguish between what's right from what's wrong. And given that, I think a free and open society benefits from absolute freedom of speech and the protections of the absolute freedom of speech for everyone, not only the people that you agree with.
Mm-hmm. Then let me ask you, Ayaan, about Wokism. What is it about Wokism, or when we spoke the other day, you said DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is principles or in ideology that is applied across all sections of society, in the Anglo-speaking world, I suppose. Here in Denmark, it's visible, but it's I don't think it's dominating to the extent it is in the United States. Why do you think Wokism is a threat to free speech, Ayaan?
So first, I think it is, and I don't think we have enough time, but let me try and as quickly as possible explain by what I mean by Wokism. It is an ideology. It is rooted in these postmodernist, deconstructionist ideas that used to live in the most minor dark rooms of universities, starting in France and Germany and having made their way to the United States in the 1960s. And, in America, we like to make things big. And so we did. And over time, there is a movement that says that they're all about social justice with a capital S and a capital J. And the first thing that I object to is that only their way of doing things is the right way. They seek power that is unchecked. If you question their ideas and how they want to apply them to society, you are smeared as a heretic and you're cancelled. And so using these tactics of either agree with me or you're threatened with losing your job, losing your reputation, and sometimes even, as we can increasingly see, violence, means that they're not giving you the opportunity to analyze their ideas, and I object to that. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion are their tactical and in some ways strategical means of infiltrating the bureaucracy, the administrative part of government, but also of universities and corporations, so that they impose their worldview on the rest of us, again, unchecked. It is neo-Marxist in terms of, the old-fashioned Marxism was all about the economy and the proletariat, those who have and those who don't. But Wokism is rooted in the cultural side of things, so entryism and taking over cultural institutions first, so that you end up controlling, rewriting history, etc., etc. But at its core, it's intolerant. It's after absolute power. It is unchecked, and that's why I object to the woke. I want to emphasize that I want to guarantee them freedom of speech. I want to debate them. I want to expose their worldview and their patterns of work. But they have to accept that living in a free society and being in a free society, that is indeed what is going to happen. And their refusal to do so is what makes them, in my view, a very intolerant movement that is on the rise. And the more we are awake to it, the better off we are to fight against the woke.
Mm-hmm.
Fight the woke with being awake.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very familiar if you look at history, using ideologies to silence, those who subscribe to another point of view in order to promote your own power. Jacob, in this context, I mean, what do you see as the biggest threat to free speech today? And also, I mean, you've written this wonderful book about free speech, and if you look at the history, usually it's the state that represent the main threat throughout history to free speech. How do you see that today? Speaking about what you perceive as the main threat to free speech?
Yeah, I think that's heavily dependent on where you live. So if you're in China, obviously it's going to be the government. If you're in Iran, and so on. But I think a culture of free speech is probably the most important factor for having robust legal protections of free speech. So, the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, but it took a very long time before it was actually anything more than a paper tiger. For a very long time, it didn't really offer any legal protection. You have to go into 1925 before it applied to the states rather than only the federal government. And even in the 50s, you could go to jail for being a communist, and so on. So that reflected an underlying change in the culture of free speech, of viewing tolerance of dissent as a strength of society. And so I think in many democracies, the culture of free speech is being eroded from several sides. So one, I don't particularly like the term woke. I prefer to use something like illiberal identitarianism, because it often has to do with identity, and sort of very categorical definitions of identity that defines your rights, and then with a specific class who determines who falls into which category, and the rights that those categories should have, and is, in my view, an incoherent worldview, which certainly has intolerant tendencies. But I would also say that there's a counter reaction from the right, and especially in this country. So using state power. So if you go, Florida is a good example with the Stop Woke initiatives by DeSantis, where sort of old school laws restricting free speech, violating the First Amendment, as judges have concluded. So that to me suggests that in the US, the culture of free speech may be eroded due to the partisanship and polarization, where people view free speech through their own narrow lens and view the others as the ultimate threat that justifies restrictions in order to save society. And that's a dangerous spiral, I think, and that leaves very little room, for principled free speech proponents, because what you will often be confronted with is that you're sort of a wishy-washy both-sidism that doesn't understand either sort of the impending fascism that the right will impose, or sort of how the left will dissolve all the basic values of society, and nothing will be left standing. But fortunately, we can look back at history and see that these kinds of arguments have been made many times before, that now things are different, and this particular movement needs to be restricted. When often that has resulted in very draconian restrictions on free speech that, when looking back at it, are difficult or impossible to justify for later generations. So I would say that in the West, I think the culture of free speech is eroding. At a European level, there's certainly lots of regulation going on from the European Union, for instance, the Digital Services Act, idea to harmonize hate speech laws across the member states and so on, which I think is a danger. And then sort of this development that I've described in the US, where maybe the left is more focusing on cultural institutions, and the right is increasingly, at least in Republican-dominated states, trying to use state power to counter liberal identitarianism.
Mm-hmm. We have a little more than 15 minutes left, and so far I have 2 good questions and 1 comment that I might want to share if we'll have the time.
I wanted to please make 1 comment though on the
yes, sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Illiberal identitarianism.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make the remark that what I find very strange about the woke movement is that, yes, there's a lot of identity politics going on, and there's a lot of dividing society along lines of race and gender, etc. But if you look at the elites behind the ideas and the logistics of it, they're white middle class, white upper class, boomers, and millennials, I think bored out of their wits and very romantic and fantasizing about some kind of social justice that is not familiar to the rest of us. There are some very big Black names like Ibram X. Kendi and so on. But really, if you look through that movement, you will be amazed at their social status, upper middle class, their income, their education, and their skin color. Very strange.
Yeah. As I said, we have about 15 minutes left and a couple of questions. And we cannot do this probably without talking about the digital age and free speech. So Jacob, maybe you want to go first to provide us with some historical perspective. I mean, in what way, when we entered the debate about free speech 15 years ago or so, Facebook had just come into existence. There was no Twitter, I think, but now it's a public platform where we engage with one another, and it's a very different kind of interacting than face to face. So what should we think about when it comes to free speech in this context of this digital revolution, Jacob?
Well, we should first of all acknowledge that things are likely to be messy for a long time. Think about the printing press and how long it took before you had sort of anything like quality journalism and the like. It's disruptive, and that's probably inevitable. But I think that there's been a huge shift in the sense that the internet, or the World Wide Web in the 90s was seen as a radically egalitarian, decentralized model of communication outside corporate and state control. That has completely changed in the sense that we have a much more centralized, platformized social media environment where private platforms can act as chokeholders, and increasingly they do so under pressure from governments and interest groups, and do it in a very untransparent manner. And inevitably, when you have to content moderate millions of comments an hour, that will result in a lot of subjective decisions that one or the other group can see as targeted against them. So I think one way to think more positively about that is try to revert the more decentralized models where users have more control over what they are being confronted with, rather than having big platforms make the decisions top down. I think that would be an improvement on where we are right now. But it comes with its own dilemmas, and I think, as I said, I think it will take a long time before we've sort of adjusted our mindset, developed in the analog age to the digital age, and sort of updated our institutions and so on. I think, you know, there are some underlying issues that make this a perfect storm: a collapse in trust in political institutions, elite institutions, the media that had already begun before the social media really kicked off. And unless those institutions are able to adjust to a new age and provide new meaning for people, I think social media will continue to provide a lot of disruption to society. But I still think that the benefits of social media outweigh the dangers and the harms.
I mean, one concept that's been talking a lot about is content moderation or content regulation, that we had to work out rules how to regulate speech online, similar to the ways we are regulating speech offline. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's sort of a bit of a cliche, right? Because, you know, speech is very sort of contextual, right? And you know, so something published in Denmark that is then being read, maybe auto-translated in Cairo or Karachi, might not be understood in the same way. So I don't think, you know, I think it's a simplistic formula that is being offered by politicians who don't really understand, but feel a need to react forcefully against these forces that erode their own authority, and that are sometimes rightly seen as providing threats to democracy. And I think it's also very, you know, it's frustrating as a politician, because as a politician, you know, the reason why you're in office is to be able to make changes, and suddenly you have these powers that you don't understand, and the only way to seem to be in power is to impose sort of control. But I think one thing that fools a lot of people into supporting this is that it's very easy to paint big tech platforms as the bad guys and those that are the subject of legislation, when they could in reality say, we don't really care, we're a business. So if we want to cozy up with legislators who want to regulate us, we can do that. We can remove all kinds of contents. The real losers are the ordinary users who had been relying on these platforms to say things in the public sphere that they couldn't before, because no journalist would hand them a microphone. No one would publish their writings and so on.
Mm-hmm. Ayaan?
I think that the word disinformation is just a 4-syllable word for the 1-syllable word lie. And as long as there have been human beings, people have been lying to one another. And whether you lie online or whether you lie on paper or whether you lie verbally, it's a lie. And I think what it then amounts to is, do you want governments to actually legislate lying? Do you want to say that you want your government to ban people from lying? I don't think anybody wants that. I mean, think about commercials that we see every day. Where would that go, and how would we legislate that?
I know a lot of people who would like that.
Yes, exactly. So I think the term disinformation, every time I hear it, I think of the Communist Party of China. It is their way of imposing their will and their rules on the people of China. And I think this, what you are seeing is a lot of these authoritarian governments, especially when they become great powers like China, are exporting their sensibilities and trying to impose it on the American public and in other open societies. So for me, the word disinformation simply means lie, fraud. We've talked about fraud, that's already legislated. I wholeheartedly agree with Jacob that if you look at technology on the whole, it has been more beneficial than it has been destructive. I always love to use the analogy of fire. think about what you can do with fire in terms of destruction, but also think about fire with what we couldn't live as human beings in the civilized world that we live in without fire. And so that for me is also technology. You can cause a lot of harm with it, but you can also do a lot of good with it. And for those of us who are fighting for freedom of speech, I think we just have to get into the fight. We have to make more time. We have commit more, and I'm sure we're going to win. And technology is on our side. So I think bashing technology altogether, it just hands the other side more power.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have about 8 minutes or so, so I want to now go to the questions, and thanks to the audience for your patience so far. The first question is to Jacob. Can you give us, and it's from Tracy Keys, can you give us examples of elitist top-down gatekeepers today?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Digital Services Act by the European Union, which I think is a classic example. So it's an attempt by the European Union and member states to sort of say, well, the social media and the internet has become the Wild West, unregulated, which I think is a bit of a misunderstanding, but be that as it may. So let's try to impose some kind of top-down centralized control of this sphere, with the European Commission acting as sort of a regulator. So that, I think, is a classic example of sort of elitist free speech conception. Another place where you might see it is growing administrative bureaucracy on universities that sort of delve into academic freedom, sort of saying what can and cannot be said or taught at universities. Where it's sort of coming from the top and in edicts that affect students and faculty. And of course, increasingly, private platforms, tech platforms, have also, even though they sort of promised egalitarian free speech, have increasingly adopted more and more speech restrictive guidelines, and sometimes directly or indirectly hand in hand with governments.
Mm-hmm. And I think the next question, Ayaan, is for you. It's Peter Balfour. While democracy sounds like a good idea, I'm concerned that the white population of the United Kingdom in, say, the 1960s is being replaced by, for example, Pakistani Muslims, who I believe are trying to outbreed us, become a majority in the country, and because they seem to vote with one voice, choose the government they want, which I fear would not be sympathetic to anyone who was not a Muslim. Do you think this is simply a natural evolution, or that there is a time when democracy ceases to be appropriate, as perhaps free speech can do? Ayaan, the sound.
Right. Yes,
Okay.
what you need is a shift in perspective or in your lens. And that if you say, you know, the white natives versus the immigrants, mostly Pakistanis, that's where the conflict of interest lies. I think you could shift your perspective to say there are indeed people of Pakistani origin or from other places who share an interest in democracy, in freedom of speech, and in the maintenance and the preservation of the institutions of the United Kingdom, with white people who have inherited it, you know, who are the native people. And I think that it is important to emphasize these shared interests between the people of then and now, rather than the skin color, because if you come at it from the place of skin color, it becomes a lose-lose zero-sum game, and it becomes a racial conflict rather than a conflict of ideas. I know of plenty of white people, British, who are incredibly illiberal and who want very woke and radical in their commitment to throw out all things that I would conserve in the British heritage. So I think the key way to come at this is, who do you share a common ground with, regardless of their skin color, regardless of whether they're immigrant or not, regardless of their gender? That, I think, is where I would place my perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I want to get back here in the end. I think that's basically some of the other comments are just references to books and articles that people can check out. Jacob, you said something which I found very important. I want to have your reactions to that issue as a final comment. You spoke about a culture of free speech, and the way I understand you is in fact that you can have the most perfect laws protecting free speech, like the First Amendment back in 1791, but if it's not somehow being practiced, if you do not develop a culture of free speech, then even the best laws do not promote freedom of expression. So what can we do in order to promote a culture of free speech?
Yes, that's a $1 million question. I think, and I would say that having written a book on the history of free speech, but I think a historical perspective is crucial, because those of us who live in open democracies have come, you know, with exceptions like you, Flemming, and Ayaan, who have actually, not from governments, but from private individuals, been living with threats because you have exercised free speech. But most of us have depended, and you know, you've been protected by governments committed to liberal ideals. So most of us have not experienced censorship or repression, and therefore it becomes sort of almost unthinkable that censorship of a totalitarian, authoritarian nature could creep in, and you are sort of fine with taking a slice here or there. So not taking it for granted, having a historical perspective, and then I think cultivating sort of curiosity and viewing free speech as a competitive advantage of open democracies vis-a-vis the fight against authoritarian states. Whereas I think increasingly democracies tend to think of free speech as something that undermines them, that allows Russian propaganda to creep into societies, when I think it actually allows us to debunk Russian propaganda sometimes in real time, you know, using geolocation and so on. And so sort of not being so hesitant about free speech, but also recognizing that free speech comes with harms and costs. But if we look through that historical lens, we will see that that free speech so far in history has been a force for good, at least if you're not an authoritarian with a secular or religious. And I think even though there's no guarantee, that even though free speech is a daily experiment, I would be surprised if the calculus changes in the forthcoming future.
And Ayaan, your 50 cents on how to promote a culture of free speech?
Promote a culture of free speech with more speech. More publications, more noise. Take the fight to them, to the people that you disagree with. Make it very clear, you know, what are the institutions that you're fighting for? What are the ideas that you're fighting for? For all of that, you require free speech. Then in order to organize, to raise money, to change legislation or to promote what kind of legislation you want, all of that requires free speech. So the short answer is fight it with more speech.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks a lot. That was an hour. Thanks a lot to Jacob and Ayaan on behalf of the AHA Foundation. This was the first in a series of Ayaan Hirsi Ali Dialogues. And if you want to make a contribution to the AHA Foundation or a donation, you can go to the website at theaha.org. There is a spring campaign going on, so feel free to join in if you think this was interesting and worth your support. Thanks for today. Looking forward to being in touch with you, Ayaan and Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you, Flemming. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.